With gas prices across the country surging 94 cents since the war with Iran began,
everything just seems to be going up.
The Trump administration is looking for new ways to calm rattled oil markets.
It used to be 60 something to fill my tank. Now it's 90 something to fill my tank.
Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent now announcing that the U.S. will allow for the limited sale of previously sanctioned Iranian oil. It comes as the cost of U.S. crude sits just below $100 a barrel. President Trump trying to offer reassurance.
President Trump is giving Iran 10 more days to reopen a key shipping route, the Strait of Hormuz, delaying another military action. Now, that strait is critical for oil, and right now traffic there is down sharply. Trump says he's holding off any strikes after what he describes as a request from Iran, even as Tehran denies any direct talks with the U.S.
Canada is getting hit from both sides. From the south, U.S. tariffs. From overseas, an oil shock from the U.S.-Israeli war on Iran. And when those two pressures collide inside the same economy, the result is brutal. Higher unemployment. Higher inflation risk. More pressure on households. Less room for the Bank of Canada to rescue the economy. That is the real Canadian story right now. Not just a trade dispute. Not just a foreign war. But a squeeze. A continental squeeze from American tariffs. And a global squeeze from war-driven energy inflation. And here is what makes it even more politically explosive. Mark Carney initially supported the United States acting to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon. Then, days later, he criticized Washington for not consulting allies before launching the strikes, and said the conflict reflected a broader failure of the international order. That shift matters because it captures Canada's entire problem in one frame, politically aligned enough to share the fallout, but not consulted enough to shape the decision. Now let's start with the labor market, because this is where the damage is already visible. Reuters reported that Canada's economy lost 83,900 jobs in February and the unemployment rate rose to 6.7%. That was one of the sharpest monthly declines in nearly 17 years outside the pandemic. Youth unemployment rose to 14.1%. Reuters linked the drop largely to U.S. tariffs on Canadian exports like steel, autos, and lumber, which hit investment and triggered layoffs. January and February together wiped out 109,000 jobs, nearly canceling out the gains from late 2025. That is not noise. That is not a soft patch. That is what pressure looks like when tariffs stop being headlines and start landing in payrolls. And the mechanism is straightforward. U.S. tariffs make Canadian exports less competitive. Orders weaken. Firms delay investment. Hiring freezes. Layoffs follow. Reuters reporting from Canada's tariff frontline in Windsor showed exactly this pattern. Businesses stalled projects, delayed expansion, cut orders, and scaled down operations because of U.S. trade uncertainty and fears around the future of the North American trade framework. So if you ask, what is the main direct driver of higher unemployment right now? The answer is still U.S. tariffs and the uncertainty surrounding them. But now the second pressure comes in. The war on Iran. And this is where things become more dangerous, because the war does not simply add another separate problem. It amplifies the one Canada already has. Reuters reported on March 2 that the U.S.-Israeli air war against Iran widened and drove oil and gas prices sharply higher, fueling global inflation fears. The same day, Reuters reported that the Canadian dollar weakened 0.4% to around 1.37 per US dollar even though oil rose 5.9%, because investors rushed into the US dollar as a safe haven. Canadian bond yields jumped, with the 10-year yield rising about 10 basis points to 3.229% on inflation concerns. That matters because war-driven oil shocks do not stay in commodity markets. They move through the economy. Higher oil means higher transport costs. Higher transport costs feed into food, freight, and services. Higher inflation risk pushes up yields. Higher yields make rate cuts harder. And that is exactly what the Bank of Canada is now worried about. Reuters reported that Governor Tiff Macklem said the bank would raise rates if necessary to prevent the inflation effects of the conflict from becoming persistent. Reuters also reported that economists saw the war and the oil shock as having changed the outlook, with markets leaning more toward a rate hike by year-end than they were before the conflict. So now you have the full squeeze. The tariff shock weakens hiring and investment. The oil shock raises inflation and rate risk. And the Bank of Canada gets trapped in the middle. That is what makes this episode so dangerous for Canada. If this were only a tariff story, the policy response would be one thing. If this were only an oil story, the policy response would be another. But when the economy is slowing and inflation pressure is rising at the same time, you get the worst mix of both worlds. Weak growth, weak hiring, sticky prices, and less monetary relief. That is the makings of stagflationary pressure. Now, let's be precise here. Canada is an oil exporter. So higher oil prices are not uniformly negative. Reuters reported that Canada can benefit in some ways from stronger crude prices, and earlier this month the loonie even outperformed some peers when oil surged. But Reuters also made clear that higher gasoline costs still hit disposable income and that the oil shock is complicating the broader outlook rather than rescuing the economy. That is the contradiction. Some parts of Canada benefit. Households do not. And the labor market certainly does not get a clean pass from higher oil when tariffs are already hammering industry. That is why the war exacerbates unemployment even if it is not the main initial cause. It does it through the second round effects. It makes borrowing conditions harder to ease. It pushes business costs higher. It weakens confidence. It deepens uncertainty. And it increases the chance that firms delay hiring even longer. Reuters reported on March 25 and March 27 that the Canadian dollar hit a two-month low, while analysts pointed to a 14.6% year-over-year decline in exports, the 84,000 job loss in February, and hefty U.S. tariffs on autos, steel, and aluminum as weighing on Canada's economy. At the same time, geopolitical tensions in the Middle East kept the loonie under pressure and pushed the 10-year Canadian yield up toward 3.593%, close to a two-year high. That is the pattern. Tariffs weaken the economy from the real side. War weakens it from the price and finance side. And if you are a Canadian worker or household, the distinction matters less than the result. Jobs become harder to find. Bills get harder to pay. And rate relief gets pushed further away. Now bring Carney back into the picture. This is where the politics become exposed. Carney's first position was to support the idea of preventing Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon. But Reuters later reported that he criticized the US and Israel for acting without consulting allies and said the strikes reflected a failure of the international order. That is not just a diplomatic nuance. It reveals the weakness of Canada's posture. Canada is close enough to the alliance logic to absorb the blowback, but not influential enough to shape the decision before it lands. And the economic cost of that posture is now showing up at home. If you endorse the strategic logic but do not control the military decision, you can still inherit the inflation shock. If you criticize the lack of consultation after the fact, you still cannot stop oil from spiking. And if your economy is already being squeezed by US tariffs, then the war does not arrive in a stable environment. It lands on top of weakness. That is the deeper trade economics point. Canada is not suffering because one bad thing happened. Canada is suffering because two different US-driven pressure systems are colliding at once. Protectionism and war. Tariffs weaken jobs directly. War weakens price stability indirectly. Together, they make the unemployment problem harder to solve. Now let's talk about why this matters for ordinary Canadians. If you are in manufacturing, autos, steel, or trade-linked industries, the direct tariff effect is already obvious. Reuters reporting linked the labor market decline directly to those sectors. If you are a household with a mortgage, the war matters because it keeps inflation risk alive and makes the Bank of Canada more cautious. Reuters reported that the central bank is willing to hike if inflation from the oil shock becomes persistent. If you are a consumer, the war matters because higher fuel costs spread through groceries, transport, and services. If you are a business owner, the combination of tariffs and elevated energy uncertainty means weaker demand, tighter margins, and less confidence in expanding payrolls. That is how the two shocks reinforce each other. This is not one clean crisis. It is a layered one. Now, where does this go next? The first thing to watch is the labor market. If tariffs continue to suppress orders and investment, unemployment can keep rising even before the full war-related inflation shock has worked its way through the economy. Reuters already showed that the February deterioration was sharp and broad-based. The second thing to watch is oil and the loonie. If war risk stays high, Canada can face the worst version of the contradiction. Some export upside from oil, but not enough to offset weaker domestic confidence and weaker household purchasing power. Reuters' recent currency reporting shows that safe haven flows into the US dollar can overwhelm the usual oil support for the Canadian dollar. The third thing to watch is the Bank of Canada. If inflation from energy becomes persistent, rate cuts become harder, and hikes become thinkable. Reuters has already reported that markets are leaning more toward that possibility than they were before the war. And that brings us to the final trade economics take. Canada is not being hit by one crisis. It is being trapped by two different American pressure systems at the same time. Tariffs hit from the employment side. War hits from the inflation side. One weakens hiring, investment, and industrial confidence. The other raises oil, lifts yields, and makes monetary relief harder. That is the squeeze. And once an economy is losing jobs while inflation risk stays alive, the scoreboard changes. Because the issue is no longer just growth. It is no longer just prices. It is no longer just foreign policy. It becomes a question of who absorbs the cost of decisions made elsewhere. Right now, Canada is absorbing the fallout of American protectionism and American-aligned war at the same time. That is the deeper story. Not just that unemployment is rising. Not just that inflation is getting harder to contain. But that Canada is being forced to carry the economic burden of pressures it did not fully create and did not fully control. And that is what makes this moment so dangerous. Because when tariffs weaken the job market and war weakens the path to lower rates, the middle gets crushed first. Workers, households, borrowers, small businesses. That is where the real bill lands. So here is the question that matters most. Can Canada stabilize an economy being squeezed from both sides, or is this the beginning of a much longer period where US pressure abroad and US pressure at the border keep feeding the same domestic pain? Because if that is where this is going, then this is not just a bad month for Canada. It is a warning about what happens when a middle power stays tied to a larger neighbor's trade shocks and war shocks at the same time.